Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much for being here today to talk about intertextuality in Beowulf and in the work of the Inklings, Tolkien, Lewis, and Williams. I'm glad to be sharing this topic with you today. Just to get it out of the way, what is intertextuality? Well, it's simply a way of talking about how texts interact with each other. So we'll be going through some of the ways that these texts interact with each other and some of the methods of textual interaction that they use. To begin with, one of my earliest encounters with intertextuality occurred when I was quite young, and my father read to me C.S. Lewis's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. At the beginning of the story, the narrator tells the reader that Eustace Clarence Scrubb liked books if they were books of information and had pictures of grain elevators or of fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools. Later, when he sees a strange, scaly, winged creature in a lonely valley, we are not surprised to learn that, quote, Eustace had read none of the right books. He never said the word dragon to himself. And then later on, most of us know what we should expect to find in a dragon's lair. But as I said before, Eustace had read only the wrong books. They had a lot to say about exports and imports and governments and drains, but they were weak on dragons. This is the purest form of intertextuality. We have a book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, talking about other books, the right books, books that talk about dragons. So this is a very simple method, and it seems like it could just be a humorous device that C.S. Lewis is using, talking about the right books to show us about Eustace's character and experience, and that ties into part of why he became a dragon. But it's not so simple as it seems. It's actually a rather complex use of other books, and it deserves close scrutiny. So if we look carefully at this passage in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, we can learn a lot about how C.S. Lewis used earlier books. And then that can be a jumping off point for looking at how Tolkien used other books, and specifically ways that these two writers and Charles Williams employed intertextuality with methods that were similar to the Beowulf poet. So that's what we're going to go through today. And as we go through these quotes and look at The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, you'll start to understand intertextuality before I even give you some official definitions and types and categories and so forth. So first off, what I want you to notice in these quotes is that the references to other books is explicit. It's not just a subtle allusion, it's not just a faint echo. The word books is used 4 times here in this quote. So it's directly saying that this book is interacting with other books. So it's fairly obvious in its relationship to earlier books, even though it doesn't name them. So you could argue that this passage is dependent upon the earlier texts for its existence. Not that Lewis couldn't have made up dragons if he wanted to out of his head. He could have done. But the fact is that he did not. He did not make up dragons. He took them from earlier texts. And his story about Eustace is heavily dependent on these earlier texts. And what's maybe even more interesting is that the characters in the story are dependent upon the earlier texts for their reactions to the dragon and to the event as it unfolds. Now, this kind of reliance upon earlier texts and reference to other texts should not really be all that surprising, because Lewis was pretty frank and straightforward when he talked about his indebtedness to other books. He packs his private correspondence and his published works with every type of reference: allusions, titles drawn from other works, epigraphs, quotes, paraphrases, character names, and of course even full-scale adaptation of previous works. Indeed, his method was somewhat modeled upon a medieval approach, and the other day Professor Shippey referred to Lewis's essay or talk, The Genesis of a Medieval Book. So he wrote that in medieval works, there's not that clear separation of one work from another and the clear unity of the individual author with the individual text. He says, we might equally well call our medieval authors the most unoriginal or the most original of men. They are so unoriginal that they hardly ever attempt to write anything unless someone has written it before. They are so rebelliously and insistently original that they can hardly reproduce a page of any older work without transforming it by their own intensely visual and emotional imagination, turning the abstract into the concrete, quickening the static into turbulent movement, flooding whatever was colorless with scarlet and gold. So perhaps in a way this is what C.S. Lewis is doing, is he's acting like a medieval writer in that he hardly writes anything in his works that has not been tried before, and yet he transforms everything with his own originality. And as we'll see, there is some evidence that this is what the Beowulf poet does as well. But notice, furthermore, that those quotes from the Voyage of the Dawn Treader are what we could call an empty referent, or an empty referent. There are no particular books mentioned. There are no titles. The narrator says what kind of books they're not. They're not political science. They're not nonfiction books of political science. And to some extent, he says what they are. They're books that are strong on dragons. So therefore, you will get this reference to the extent that it matches up with your previous reading. So what if you were a reader who had only read the types of books that Eustace had? If you had only read political science books when you came to this, you would have no more knowledge than Eustace of what he was about to approach. As a thought experiment, we could imagine that a reader came to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader as the first work of fiction that they ever read. Or maybe not quite as extreme, you could imagine a child coming to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader as the first work about dragons that he or she had ever read. And as a matter of fact, that was my experience. The dragon that Eustace encounters was the first literary dragon that I had ever come across as a child. I did, however, have an intimate familiarity with Lego dragons, but this was the first textual dragon that I came across. So for me, this was not intertextuality. These unnamed books were not the source, and Eustace's dragons were not the derivative dragons, but rather the reverse. The old dragon that Eustace encounters and the dragon that Eustace turns into were, for me, the source text, the source dragons to which I compared all later dragons. So now I'm going to put this into theoretical terms, into the terms of theorist J.R.R. In his terms, for me, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader was a hypotext, and all other texts were hypertexts. Let's see what J.R.R. is talking about here. He wrote in 1982 in Palimpsests, "By hypertextuality, I mean any relationship uniting a text B, which I shall call the hypertext, to an earlier text A, I shall of course call it the hypotext, upon which it is grafted in a manner that is not that of commentary." So just pause over that quote to make sure that we understand this thoroughly. You have an early text that lies under, so it's the hypotext. Over it is the later text that's responding to it, so that's the hypertext. So in C.S. Lewis's intentionality in this passage, his dragons were the hypertext because they were layered on top of earlier dragons. But in my experience, that was reversed, because Eustace's dragon was the first one that I came to, and then as I grew older and encountered other dragons, they were the hypertext. So you can see that intertextuality is highly dependent upon the reader's agency, the reader's active participation in the creation of meaning in the texts, and that it depends upon the reader's experience to a certain extent. So a couple other examples of hyper and hypo texts, just to make sure that you know what that means. So Chaucer's Troilus and Cresside is a hypertext. The earlier source or hypotext it's based on is Boccaccio's Il Filostrato. Then Shakespeare came along and wrote his own Troilus and Cressida, which becomes the hypertext, of which both Chaucer's and Boccaccio's are hypotexts, and so forth. To come back to another example from the Inklings, Apuleius's myth of Psyche and Cupid in the Golden Ass is the hypotext, underneath which C.S. Lewis wrote his hypertext, Till We Have Faces. So then clearly C.S. Lewis had particular books in mind that were the hypotexts underneath these scenes with Eustace and the dragons. So what were they? Well, this can be a tricky question if we're asking just what did the author have in mind, what did the author mean? But it turns out that there is evidence in this case that we can pretty reasonably answer this question. We could look at what books C.S. Lewis referred to and quoted from most often, which ones he claimed had the greatest influence on him, which ones he studied and wrote about and taught on most frequently, or reviewed positively, and so forth. So based on this kinds of evidence, it appears that he had had 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 texts in mind when he talked about books that were strong on dragons. Clearly, Beowulf and the Volsunga saga. And then Tolkien's Hobbit clearly was in his mind when he wrote this episode. Maybe the Dragon and Spencer's Fairy Queen, perhaps the Jabberwocky. And that might be 2 dragons too many. You may remember that Tolkien wrote in The Monsters and the Critics that dragons in Northern literature are rare. He said if we omit from consideration the vast and vague encircler of the world, Mythgard-Sormer, the doom of the great gods, and no matter for heroes, we have but 2, the dragon of the Volsungs, Fafnir, and Beowulf's Bane. Of course, Tolkien himself went on to add several more dragons to that canon, but we'll get to that. So whether or not Spencer and Lewis Carroll are in the text is unclear. But my point here is that Lewis was specifically referring to Fafnir, Beowulf's Bane, perhaps we can call him Starkheart, and to Smaug in his embedded reference to the right books. He expected that his readers would have read Beowulf and the Volsunga saga, and he hoped that they would have read The Hobbit. If not, this is perhaps a kind recommendation to them that they do so. At the end of his review of The Hobbit, Lewis wrote, "Prediction is dangerous, but The Hobbit may well prove a classic." So what Lewis is doing here, among other things, is he's embedding Tolkien's Hobbit in an intertextual space along with these 2 noteworthy great classics. And so he's elevating its status by where he has placed it intertextually. Okay, so by looking through that passage in a little bit more detail, it's probably becoming clear that intertextuality could be enormously broad. It may be as broad as all the texts that have ever been created. And when I say texts, I could be including additional things besides literature and even additional materials besides just printed or written matters, because we can read any cultural product as something for interpretation. Every work of literature or every object of culture is arguably intertextual, because, as Gerald Allen wrote, every artistic object is so clearly assembled from bits and pieces of already existent art. So intertextuality is too broad. Therefore, many other terms have been proposed, each with its own application and scope. Here are some of those terms. I will certainly not go through all of them, but we can glance at a couple of the terms and think a little bit about how they could be applied. So hypertextuality, I've already talked about. It's a close relationship between 2 texts that's intentional on the part of the author. I'll talk about palimpsests in a moment. Relational reading moves the responsibility from the author to the reader, that these texts are only related if I, as the reader, recognize their relationship. I like the phrase derivative practices because it's larger. It shows how later texts derived from previous ones in a wide variety of ways. And as you see, there are other terms there, each with its own scope. Whatever term a particular theorist decides to use and whatever its scope, it includes a wide variety of writing techniques: adaptation, translation, quotation, allusion, and so forth. So I think that the Beowulf poet uses the majority of these techniques to a greater or lesser extent, and that Tolkien, Lewis, and the other Inklings learned important intertextual techniques from their studies of Beowulf. And furthermore, studying the Inklings from the point of view of intertextuality has not been done very thoroughly, so this is a new and exciting field, and it's important work that needs to be done here. And because the Inklings were poised between their professional work as medievalists and their popular work as 20th century fiction writers, this means that their writing is a perfect location to study this, because they have the medieval idea of collaborative and anonymous writing on one hand, and a 20th century view of writing in community on the other hand, both of which are rich intertextual practices. So if we look at some of the hypertextual procedures that the Beowulf poet used, that will then lay the foundation for looking at the ways that Tolkien employed a specifically Beowulfian intertextuality and some of the sophisticated methods used by Lewis and Tolkien. So that's where we're going now. Some of the Beowulf poet's methods, and then back to Tolkien, Lewis, and Williams again. And of course, do send me your questions on any of this material as I'm going through it, and I'll answer them either as we go or at the end. Okay, so let's talk about a few of the ways that Beowulf is intertextual, or hypertextual, or a delightful word, palimpsestuous. Well, first of all, it's literally, physically, a palimpsest. The Beowulf manuscript is, in places, palimpsestuous. If you take a look at this slide that I have here, this is page 179 recto in the Knoll Codex, and you can see, I hope, how some of the previous writing shows through. This is the page that Professor Shippey was talking about, where it looks like the previous writing was either erased or left out in the rain, or somehow the previous words have been obscured and the later writing has been put over it. But the previous writing still peeps through and is perhaps able to be deciphered just a little bit. So that's a literal palimpsest. A previous text that's been erased or wiped out, and a later text that's been written over it. And this page has been a site of a lot of scrutiny, trying to reconstruct the earlier text and trying to determine the final text. I think I won't spend time on that, but just to point out to you, that's not intertextuality, but it's a literal palimpsest. Okay, well, what are some other intertextual methods that are used, or some actual intertextual methods that are used in Beowulf? Well, alliterative verse. Alliterative meter, by itself, is an intertextual practice because every alliterative poem, except the first, is by its meter referring to the previous ones. Okay? So every alliterative poem is participating in a tradition. And this is true, obviously, of every poetic form. So if you decide to write a sonnet, you are intertextually participating with all prior sonnets, whether you're doing that intentionally or not. So same thing with alliterative meter here. It's participating in a tradition, and so metaphorically speaking, all the earlier alliterative poems are traces in the background behind the one in question. The previous ones show through to some faint extent, to the extent to which the given reader is aware of them or studying them or bringing them to the fore. So obviously the clearest way to look at this would be if someone wrote a paper on alliterative meter in Beowulf and referred to several earlier alliterative works for comparison. That would make that particular intertextuality come to the front and would make it obvious. All right, for most of us as readers, now in our historical time and place, there's the issue of translation. Any work that has been translated from one language into another is hypertextual because the original is the hypotext and the translation is the hypertext. So each of these different translations here on your screen, for which I've showed you the first line, is an intertextual work. Tolkien's translation for us then is a hypertext. And the clearest way to see this is when an edition is printed bilingually. When you have the Old English on one side and the translation on the other side, you can see the intertextual relationship very visually there. All right, so those are all very well, but those are not moments when the Beowulf poet was specifically using an earlier text. So why don't we get to that? Well, there's a method that's been called echo. This is when there's a textual similarity that's fairly faint, not as clear as an allusion. Just give you one quick example and move on. This is the example that Professor Shippey gave us a couple of weeks ago. The passage from Beowulf that has verbal similarities to the bit from the 16th, from Blickling Homily 16. We've got those phrases there in bold that are similar in both of the passages. So the question here is, what's happening exactly? We can see that metaphorically it's a palimpsest. There's an earlier text peeping through Beowulf, but what's happening on the literal level? Who is quoting whom? Which is the hypotext and which is the hypertext? This seems like a case described by John Hollander when the fragmentations and breakings off of intertextual echo can result in pieces of voice as small as single words and as elusive as particular cadences. So Professor Shippey called this an analog and pointed out the 5 verbal similarities. And as it turns out, the Blickling homily is self-derived from an earlier text, the Latin Vision of St. Paul. So the Vision of St. Paul is actually the hypotext, and both of these that you have on your screen are hypertexts built above it. So it seems likely that it's neither a direct quote nor perhaps even an intentional allusion, although we can't prove that, of course. It might be an echo, which may have arisen accidentally or as a result of connections drawn in a reader's mind rather than the author's. John Hollander wrote, "In contrast with literary allusion, echo is a metaphor of alluding, and it does not depend on conscious intentions. The referential nature of poetic echo, as of dreaming, may be unconscious or inadvertent. It's a pointing to or a figuration of a text recognized by the audience. That's not the point," he says. The audience doesn't have to recognize it. It's just a faint echo. And this is a perfect instance of it because the effect of this echo is to create the right mood. So whether the Beowulf poet was intentionally alluding to the Vision of St. Paul or not doesn't matter, because the mood is created, and it's an echo of a scene in hell. So this gives the perfect atmosphere for the setting of Grendel's mother's lair. Who knows, maybe it's even an oblique theological commentary on the spiritual condition of the souls of Grendel and his mother. So that's echo. But there's a more important kind of intertextuality that's going on throughout Beowulf, and it's structural. And I think it would be called architextuality. Arguably, the entire narrative structure of Beowulf is built around a very complex, very carefully constructed architextuality. Here's one possible way of visualizing the structure of Beowulf. Of course, as we've been discussing, there are many other ways of doing this, and thank you to Professors Shippey and Goering for giving their input on this little chart. So this is one way you could look at the way Beowulf proceeds, that you have 3 large episodes, and then you have sub-episodes or digressions, whatever you would like to call them. And at least these, that I've now put in blue and underlined, at least these 5, 6 episodes are clearly, overtly hypertextual, a retelling of a story that was apparently known to the poem's original audience. So it seems that each of these stories of Scyld, of Sigemund, Heremod, Finn and Hengist, Offa's queen, Friaro, and Ingeld, it seems that each of these was a pre-existing story that the Beowulf poet then retold and put into the fabric of his tale on purpose. What they are exactly, though, is not known. Are they direct quotations lifted wholesale in the same exact metrical form and diction from a pre-existing source? Or are they imitations in which the verbal choices change but the content remains the same? Or are they serious transformations, what Genet calls transpositions of known stories? If so, how far does the adaptation go? Were they put into verse from prose? Are they condensations, expansions, what? Well, we don't know. This is a problem for us because in most of these cases, whatever source material the Beowulf poet was using, it has been lost. At the end of his long study of many different kinds of adaptation and transformation, J.R.R. Genet writes, "Whatever the highly variable degree of their emancipation or their complexity, all the hypertexts discussed so far have presented themselves to us as transformations and or imitations of previous works, whether single or multiple, that were known to us, with which they could be compared so as to assess their difference and the nature of the hypertextual relation. But there are works that we know or suspect to be hypertextual whose hypotext is missing." So this is the case with most, if not all, of Beowulf. The hypotexts are missing. We don't have the earlier texts to which to compare them so that we can see exactly what the Beowulf poet was doing. And the effect of these missing hypotexts is very powerful and it would seem very positive, because it creates a sense of great depth. It creates a sense of great learning, of great lore, and of great passages of time. The reader gets the feeling that the Beowulf poet had at his disposal a vast fund of stories, characters, wisdom, and culture that has been lost, except in his retellings. So when we look through these moments in the poem where the hypotexts have been lost, it feels like looking down a deep, dark well. And as we know from Tuesday's lecture on Tolkien's Legendarium, the quality that Tolkien valued the most in fiction was a great sense of depth. And then he tried to create a great sense of depth in his own works by creating mostly a manuscript history for them, a transmission history for his texts. So it should be clear to you by now that intertextuality is one of the main ways that a work of fiction can create a sense of depth, especially maybe when the stories it's referring to have developed organically over a great period of time from a great number of minds, such as an oral tradition or a collection of legends or folk tales or fairy stories, or also when their source texts are lost. So that adds a sense of mystery to the sense of depth. So you can see how Tolkien would be drawn to this particular kind of intertextuality, what Genet calls the baffling hypertext, the one where the source has been lost, because it has that sense of great depth of time and of a past. So this is a particularly rich kind of self-referential intertextuality in Tolkien. He tries to create that sense of depth by creating hypertexts that have a missing hypotext. So it seems to me that here he was trying to imitate the effect of Beowulf rather than the method used by the Beowulf poet, or trying to fake it. Okay, so that's one thing that Tolkien learned from the Beowulf poet's intertextuality. We'll talk about two more throughout our time today, and these others Lewis and Williams used as well. So right now I want to move on to a particular kind of intertextuality on a specific topic, and that is what I'm calling true myth. True myth is the idea that all religions, philosophies, and mythologies reach their maturity in Christianity, and that paganism is comprised of hints that are fulfilled in Christianity. This is an idea that was very important to Tolkien, to Lewis, and to Williams. As you can tell from how I'm summarizing it, it's the opposite of Deacon Alcuin's question, what has Ingeld to do with Christ? Because this doctrine says that Ingeld has a lot to do with Christ. Indeed, that Ingeld or any other pagan hero or deity paved the way for Christ, prepared the human imagination by presenting people with certain kinds of stories, so that then when the story of Christ happened, the human imagination would be ready to receive it. It's a little bit like what St. Augustine called plundering the Egyptians, which is taking the truth from every religion, philosophy, or ideology and appropriating it for Christianity. The argument goes because it came from God in the first place, and so it can come back to God's people and in the Christian worldview. So I think that the Beowulf poet does this too. I think that throughout the poem, the Beowulf poet has a very calm, even-handed approach to the pagan material, and that it doesn't bother him. He doesn't seem to think that he needs to force it into a Christian framework, a Christian shape. He doesn't need to make it into a Christian narrative. This is particularly the case if you agree with Tolkien's commentary, where he says that the most Christian condemnatory bits are later interpolations. Excuse me. Let me just give one example from Beowulf of where I see this this kind of true myth approach occurring. It's the use of the Schild-Chafing hypotext as the opener for the story. Clearly, historically, Scyld the Valiant must be a pagan, yet the narrator says confidently that God sent him for the comfort of the people, and boldly claims that by worthy deeds in every folk is a man ennobled. So I don't think that a debate about the narrator's complicated pagan Christian synthesis is really necessary at this point. Instead, it appears plain to me that the narrator is using a pagan story to tell a true myth. It is a universal truth that folk are ennobled by worthy deeds, whether those folk are Christians or not. But furthermore, the Beowulf poet seems to be using Scyld for a larger purpose than just praising noble deeds or heroic actions. He tells the story carefully and shapes the story to emphasize Scyld's mysterious origins and mysterious departure across the sea, and also those mysterious beings, those that in the beginning sent him forth alone over the waves, who sent him out as a baby and received him again in death. So you see what the Beowulf poet is doing there. We've talked about this a few times this semester. He's elevating Scyld to a level above a local culture hero. He's making him an archetype. And an archetype of what? Of a mysterious, kingly savior figure who comes from a divine origin and returns to a divine source, or at least a mysterious origin and a mysterious source. So in other words, in this reading, the Beowulf poet is emphasizing the true myth elements of the story of Scyld. But he does so in this subtle, even-handed manner, not hitting his audience over the head with Christian doctrine. It's certainly not a Bible-thumping poem. The specifically Christian elements, as we've discussed, are very, very minimal. It seems more like they're virtuous monotheists, as are Tolkien's characters. So this is clearly then the method that Tolkien used in the majority of his writing. It's set in a pre-Christian world, and his heroes are pagan archetypes who are there to communicate truth, rather than Christian characters who are there to communicate doctrine. As a matter of fact, his writing method is so subtle that there are even debates over whether the work is Christian or not. Here's a quote from Charles Moseley about Tolkien's writing approach. Tolkien's Christian understanding of the nature of the world was fundamental to his thinking and to his major fiction. Neither propaganda nor allegory at its It is neither propaganda nor allegory. At its root lies the Christian model of a world loved into being by a creator, whose creatures have the free will to turn away from the harmony of that love, to seek their own will and desires, rather than seeking to give themselves in love to others. This world is one of cause and consequence, where everything matters, however seemingly insignificant. So that's one way to look at the text of the Beowulf manuscript and to look at Tolkien's writings as well. And it's a specifically intertextual method because all of the earlier pagan stories are the hypotext, and then the resulting story, Beowulf or Lord of the Rings, is the hypertext. So now I'm going to give you a couple of metaphors for thinking about what I've just been discussing for this pagan and Christian material. So these are metaphors only, and the first one especially involves a little bit of what we tend to call cryptfic, or making up a story about how something proceeded. But I mean it for it to be a metaphor about the resulting text rather than a chronological story of how something happened. So here we go. Let's imagine that the Beowulf poet is assembling his materials to write his poem, and he has in front of him the bear's son's tale. So he has this pre-existing folk tale, and he lays it down first, and it's sort of the fundamental first early text. And it's pagan material. It's pre-Christian in origin and content. But this did not bother the poet, because he believed that the myth was, as C.S. Lewis wrote later, profound and suggestive of meanings beyond his grasp, and that the pagan stories are God expressing himself through the mind of poets. So he didn't feel like he had to interpret the material, turning it into a Christian parable or allegory. He let it suggest its meaning subtly, without him stating them straight out. Okay, and then he found another pile of texts ready to his hand, pre-existing stories that would enrich his poem: Scyld, Sigemund, Heremod, Finn and Hengest, and he layered them in. Texts about myths and heroes. And then on top of this pagan material, he laid down the historical stories that he had arranged into a careful chronology: Hrothgar, Hygelac, Ingeld, the wars of the Geats and the Swedes and the Danes, the Heathobards, perhaps material from Lyra, and layered this over the fairy tale hypotext. So you see that each time you add one, the one below it becomes a hypotext. So again, in Tolkien's reading, he did not feel the need to update these pagan people into Christians. He knew they were pagans and regretted it, but he would not change this historical reality to suit Alcuin. So finally, on top of all these, he put his actual text, the story that we have, all the material that he made up, and the fabric into which he wove it all. So the final result is the hypertext, and you can see these hypotexts glancing through from underneath. That's one metaphor. And the top layer is where we have the Christian narrative voice, the only part of the poem that can be explicitly identified as Christian. Of course, it does sometimes interpret the hypotextual material doctrinally in those condemnatory passages. But perhaps looking at it this way is one of the motivating factors that made Tolkien want to think that those were later interpolations. Usually, the Beowulf poet is content to let the story be a story set in a historical era rather than using it to preach. So describing it that way leads to the second and the better metaphor for understanding what we have here. I don't really like thinking of it as a stratigraphic composition with these layers of deposits that are at least theoretically separable, because to separate them is to kill the text that we have. Instead, perhaps we could think of it as a woven fabric. The entire poem from beginning to end is one smooth sheet of cloth with carefully chosen threads woven together so that their varying origins are not perceptible to the touch of the reader. Mythic material and historical material woven together into one new smooth story. So I think that this corresponds better to the Beowulf poem as we have it. It's carefully crafted, it's unified, and so forth. But I'm going to leave that there and move on so we have time to discuss Lewis and a bit more Tolkien and some Charles Williams. So I've mentioned how Tolkien used this approach in The Lord of the Rings. I've got a screen there about the idea of sacrifice. Skip over that. But before I move to the next intertextual piece, just to say I think this is the approach that C.S. Lewis is using Until We Have Faces as well. His hypotext, the material that he got from Apuleius and from Greek philosophy and from many other places, from poetry of various sources, is all very smoothly woven together into one smooth texture so that its intertextuality doesn't show. And specifically, the way it's woven together is the method of the true myth, that each element of the pre-existing texts is carefully chosen to communicate a Christian truth in a subtle way, in a smooth story, until we have faces. So I think Till We Have Faces is a perfectly integrated Beowulfian story whose Christian hypertext does not show through its pagan hypotext at any point. And yes, I know, I said those upside down. That's the way it is until we have faces. Okay, so those are some of the ways that they use the true myth type of intertextuality, and that they may have either learned from the Beowulf poet or at least recognized and admired in the Beowulf poet's work. So let's move on, or actually back, to intertextual dragons now, because this is another area of the Inklings' writings in which intertextuality is very rich and rewarding, and it's actually important. Dragons are important locations to analyze in each of the Inklings' writings, as you shall see. Okay, the intertextual nature of Tolkien's dragons is fairly obvious and has been discussed frequently. In Beowulf, the dragon is awakened after a man steals a gold-plated goblet. In The Hobbit, Bilbo steals the two-handed gold cup, and so forth. So there's a very clear borrowing from one text to another. And let's look at the deaths of each of these dragons as well, and see the intertextual ways that those are being used. So here's the death of the dragon from Beowulf. With mighty strength he smote with warlike sword, and fast in the heat it stood, driven by fierce hate. So first Beowulf strikes the dragon's head, and then the dragon bites Beowulf, And I'm reading a bit more than is on your screen here. Dragon bites Beowulf, but Beowulf heeded not those jaws. Nay, his hand was burned. As valiant he aided now his kinsman, and smote that alien creature a little lower down, so that bright and golden hilted his sword plunged in, and the fire began thereafter to abate. Notice the phrase a little lower down than the head. So the first time the dragon is wounded on the head, next time lower down than the head, and then the third part, again reading more than is on your screen. Once more the king himself mastered his senses, drew forth a deadly dagger, keen and whetted for the fray that he wore against his mail. Lord of the wind-loving folk, he ripped up the serpent in the midst. So in the midst, in the middle of the dragon. So the stroke that eventually kills the dragon is in the midst, apparently from below. So stabbing in the stomach or the chest or somewhere from below the dragon. As a small side note too, just note that the dragon is venomous. Okay, then moving on to Fafnir and the Volsunga saga. Here's the moment when Sigurd kills the dragon. He was advised to dig holes in the ground for the black dragon's blood to flow into, and then to hide in a hole himself. And so he did. He made the pits as was shown to him. I apologize for the archaic translation that I have here, but it's the one that was ready to hand. And I'll read what you have on the screen, and I'll go on and read a little bit more beyond that as well. Now crept the worm down to his place of watering, and the earth shook all about him, and he snorted forth venom on all the way before him as he went. But Sigurd neither trembled nor was adread at the roaring of him. So when as the worm crept over the pits, Sigurd thrust his sword under his left shoulder, so that it sank in up to the hilts. Then up leapt Sigurd from the pit, and drew the sword back again unto him, and therewith was his arm all bloody, up to the very shoulder. And now reading on a little bit. Now when that mighty worm was ware that he had his death wound, then he lashed out head and tail, so that all things soever that were before him were broken to pieces. And then the dragon speaks. So when as Fafnir had his death wound, he asked, Who art thou, and who is thy father, and what thy kin? And they go back and forth a little bit. Sigurd at first refuses to tell him his father, and then eventually does. So as the dragon is dying, they have a conversation about Sigurd's family. So keep that in mind, because now, of course, we are jumping to compare to not the Hobbit, but Turin from the Unfinished Tales. So here's the moment when Turin gives Glaurung his death wound. Turin climbed the cliff from stone to stone and root to root, until he seized at last a slender tree that grew a little beneath the chasm. And even as he steadied himself in a fork of its boughs, the midmost parts of the dragon came above him, and swayed down with their weight almost upon his head, ere Glaurung could heave them up. Then Turambar drew the black sword of Beleg, and stabbed upwards with all the might of his arm and of his hate, and the deadly blade, long and greedy, went into the belly even to its hilts. Then Glaurung, feeling his death pang, gave forth a scream, whereat all the woods were shaken. So the first thing to notice there, of course, is that again, the wound is from below, stabbing upwards, somewhere in the middle of the dragon. And then let me again read on more than what you have here. Skipping ahead, Glaurung speaks to Nienor. Hail, Nienor, daughter of Hurin, we meet again ere the end. I give thee joy that thou hast found thy brother at last. And goes on to speak about Turin. So we have the intertextualities here should be quite clear and obvious. We have direct references to the ways of killing a dragon throughout Northern literature that Tolkien picks up on and puts into his own stories. We have the idea that the dragon will speak to his killer, or the killer's sister in this case, before death, and that the conversation will have to do with the warrior's family, and that the results of these conversations will not be good for the warrior. So we have the stealing of the cup, the way that the dragon is killed, and the conversation with the dragon about the warrior's family. So these are very specific and clear intertextualities. Tolkien is in conversation with these older legends of northern dragons in his work. Now to come back to the Hobbit again, a very particular moment in the Hobbit. After Bilbo goes down the tunnel again, no, after Bilbo goes down the first time, then after that, Smaug had an uneasy dream in which a warrior, altogether insignificant in size, but provided with a bitter sword and great courage, figured most unpleasantly. So Smaug has a nightmare. Well, of whom is Smaug dreaming here? And what kind of a dream is this? How would Macrobius categorize this dream? Is it a visio that is a clear and certain prediction that is immediately fulfilled? Well, it is, right? Smaug is, after all, killed very shortly after this dream. But he is not, of course, killed by Bilbo. So the dream then is not a clear and certain prediction. So is the dream a somnium, which is a predictive dream, but one that is unclear and uncertain, perhaps allegorical, and certainly requiring interpretation? So that might be, the warning is clear, a warrior with a sharp weapon is coming, beware this warrior, but not a clear prediction, because Smaug is not killed by a sword, and not by the little warrior with the sharp sword that he just met. Well, it's clearly a very rich moment of intertextuality, and it's referring to so many texts simultaneously that listing them out and going through them is fairly complicated, but let me attempt to do so, and feel free to ask questions about this as I go through. So, the first text to which it might be referring, to which it is certainly referring, is a draft of The Hobbit in which Tolkien originally planned to have Bilbo kill Smaug. So this is a new kind of intertextuality I haven't mentioned yet, which is self-referential intertextuality. Tolkien is referring to one of his own texts, but it's clearly a palimpsest because the earlier text is completely erased. It was only in notes. It never actually made it to a manuscript, so I shouldn't have said drafts. It was just planning notes that Tolkien wrote for himself. So it's referring to an erased text. Okay, well, how many readers know that? Okay, but intertextuality does not always have to be in the mind of the reader. Well, let's go on. It's also clearly referring to Beowulf, in which a warrior who is small in size compared to the dragon does show great courage and does figure unpleasantly from the dragon's point of view. And it's clearly referring to Volsunga Saga, ditto. A dream in which a small warrior comes and figures most unpleasantly. And to add on to the allusion to the Volsunga Saga, in another note, Tolkien considered having Bilbo hardened by the dragon's blood, much the way Sigurd is changed by the blood of Fafnir. All right, but this is a problem. Do you see the problem here? There's an intertextual problem. There's a problem of reference. Smaug could not be dreaming of Beowulf and Sigurd because in the chronology of Middle-earth, Beowulf and Sigurd had not lived yet. So he couldn't be dreaming of them in the sense of having a memory of them. Smaug's story happens ages before Beowulf or Sigurd appeared in human history and legend when we're in the internal fictional chronology. So perhaps his dreams are prophetic in that sense, that he is dreaming ahead of time about what will happen to Fafnir and Starkheart, Beowulf's bane. So then his dreams work in both directions. They work backward in literary history, because Beowulf and Volsunga Saga were written before The Hobbit, but they work forward in internal fictional chronology, because Smaug's story happened before these two other tales. So that's a really beautiful, complicated piece of intertextuality that Tolkien is pulling off there in this apparently simple children's story. And there are two other texts of which Smaug may also have been dreaming. So let's complicate it even more. One is Tolkien's own legend of Sigurd and Gudrun, his retelling of episodes from the Volsunga Saga, which he was working on in the 1930s, but which was not published until 2009. So Tolkien knew that he was working on this text himself, but there was no way that readers of The Hobbit could know it. And furthermore, last one here, Tolkien is making another self-referential allusion to his own legendarium, to, perhaps, the tale of Turin, which we just saw above. So Smaug could have been dreaming of Turin. Glaurung's death upon Turin's sword had already happened in the fictional history of Middle-earth, so Smaug could have been remembering it. but it had not yet happened in the real history of publication. So the original readers of The Hobbit could not have gotten the illusion. So it's a baffling hypertext, in J.R.R. Genet's terms. It's a dead hyperlink. If you were to click on hyperlink Turin in 1937, you wouldn't get anything. There was nothing available yet. No one could possibly have known of this, perhaps apart from C.S. Lewis and a few of Tolkien's family members, which is another kind of intertextuality, the intertextuality of writerly communities. When writers who are working together, who know each other and exchange texts, make cross-references to their texts in each other's work. So Tolkien does all of those kinds, just with that one little parenthetical reference to Smaug's dream in The Hobbit. And we don't know whether those two kinds of intertextuality, the self-referential and the communal, were used by the Beowulf poet or not. It is possible, and it seems probable, but it's impossible to know. The Beowulf poet may have written a full adaptation of the story of Signum, for all we know, or the full story, say, of Onella's Queen, and it's been lost and we don't have the text. Or maybe another poet in his community had been working on one of those stories and he had heard it, and so he works it into his own. Those situations seem likely to me because the poet proceeds on the assumption that his audience knows those stories. So how would he know that his audience was familiar with those stories? Well, either because he had himself presented them with those tales at some time in the past, or because he had been present when he had heard other poets present those tales to the same audience. So it seems likely that there may be self-referential and or communal intertextuality in the Beowulf poet, but we will never know. And it is certainly there in Lewis and Williams. I recommend to you the study by Diana Pavlak-Glyer called The Company They Keep, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien as Writers in Community. This is a full-length study of essentially communal intertextuality, cross-influence, the ways that the Inklings worked together, how when they collaborated, when they revised, when they reviewed each other's works, and so on and so forth. So it's a very detailed study of that particular type of intertextuality. So now you should see how the account with which I began of Eustace in Dragond is even richer than we first knew, because it has communal intertextuality built into it. So it's drawing in all the possible texts that we've discussed so far today about dragons, as well as Tolkien's unpublished works, which Lewis would have heard read out loud at meetings of the Inklings, and to the communal nature of their writing lives. So let's see. I will finish up the last few minutes here before questions with talking about Charles Williams and dragons. So certainly be sending me your questions on any of this material as we go through. And before I get into Williams's dragons, let me just say that Williams is perhaps the richest intertextual writer of the three, but not surprisingly, in his own strange and unique way, because Williams' texts, especially his Arthurian poetry, but also the novels, are woven from layers and layers of occult derivative practices, from secret self-referential intertextuality, cross-references to his own complicated symbolic mythology to which he never provides a key, and also a theology about communities of reading, communities of writing, and communities of mutual exchange. So Williams is very richly intertextual. And if I had more time, I could have gone through his intertextual geography that he develops for his Arthurian stories, or any number of other ways. But we'll stick with dragons right now, and we'll talk about dragons and Charles Williams to wrap up. So there are no live dragons in Charles Williams' works. There are a few powerful, important serpents, but there are no living dragons. Instead, in his Arthurian poetry, dragon is a metonym, a symbol of an object related. It's a metonym for King Arthur, for Arthur Pendragon. Now, I'm talking here about his two late volumes of Arthurian poetry, Taliesin through Logres, published in 1938, and The Region of the Summer Stars, published in 1944, which are his poetic masterpieces. He wrote other scattered Arthurian poems here and there throughout his life, but these are his two collected volumes of Arthurian poetry and probably his masterpiece. Okay, so the dragon is a symbol in the Arthurian poetry. It's the emblem of King Arthur. It's the heraldic image on King Arthur's banner. When Arthur is crowned, all the knights gather together at Camelot to celebrate his coronation, and they all have their banners, and it's a beautiful, colorful display. And the poem, The Crowning of King Arthur, goes through each of the banners and discusses each of their heraldic emblems. And at one moment, prophetically, at the zenith, lion and dragon rose, clawed, screamed, and twisted. So the lion is the emblem of Lancelot, and the dragon is the emblem of Arthur. So there at the moment of King Arthur's coronation, the lion and the dragon banners get tangled in the wind, and this is a symbol of Lancelot and Arthur fighting later on in the history of Camelot. And then later, as the kingdom is falling apart, Mordred claims, "I too am a dragon," as his way of claiming the king's blood. But the most important passages for our discussion today, because they loop us back around to where we began, occur in the poem Bors to Elaine on the King's Coins in Taliesin through Logres. So Sir Bors, one of the knights, has been to Camelot. He's been sitting on the king's council, and he comes home to talk to his wife. And he says, "The king has set up his mint by Thames. He has struck coins. His dragon's loins germinate, a crowded creaturely brood to scuttle and scurry between towns and towns, to furnish dishes and flagons with change of food. Small crowns, small dragons hurry to the markets under the king's smile, or flat in houses squat. The long file of the snouts crosses the empire." So, okay, so far so good. That sounds all right. The king has made coins. Arthur has had coins printed that perhaps have the king's face, his profile on one side, and an image of his heraldic blazon, the dragon, on the other side. And so these coins are circulating all around the empire as symbols and real agents of his political and economic power. So that seems fine. And analyzing this passage intertextually seems pretty simple too. The dragon is a stand-in, a metonym for King Arthur. But the dragon is also a location, a point in the text that's a stand-in for all the other representations of King Arthur that have gone before. In his prose study, The Figure of Arthur, Williams discusses all of his hypotexts, his sources. He goes through the history of all the Arthurian texts that he has used, including, of course, Geoffrey of Monmouth, Robert de Boron, Chrétien de Troyes, Mallory, and many other sources. In the 1930s and 40s, when Williams was writing these poems, all of those versions of the King Arthur story were circulating around England, around Europe, and around the world. So these little gold dragon coins are emblematic of the whole Arthurian legend. And of course, all previous stories of dragons are compressed into these little coins as well. All the powerful, kingly, dangerous, magnificent dragons gather into one in the glorious person of King Arthur. So it's as if when you read the word dragon or coin in Charles Williams' poetry, it's like you could click on the word, click on the hyperlink, and a whole intertextual world, a window, would pop up. So the dragon coin is like a hyperlink. Now I'm going to read from a piece of writing from Lewis scholar Brenton Dickinson, who was working on this idea of the hyperlink as an important intertextual metaphor. Dickinson writes, "Hyperlinks help us in imagining the echo. If I recognize a hypertextual echo in a book, my mind drifts back to the hypotext, the source text. In etextual worlds, the hypertext will be highlighted, a hyperlink. So literally, if you're reading a word on your Kindle, you can press it and something will pop up. This is the clearest physical form of intertextuality. So theoretically, you could do an annotated edition that whenever a writer referred to an earlier text, you could click on it and the earlier text would pop up. Okay, back to Dickinson's quote. Clicking the hyperlink brings the reader not just back to the original quotation or specific idea that the belated author is referencing, but actually brings the reader back to the original context. A hyperlink has the power of evoking for the reader the entire symbolic universe of the linked text or image. C.S. Lewis, he says, is a hyperlink type writer. He uses little images, elusive echoes, and avatar-like references to link a reader back, not just to a previous text, but to previous textual worlds. So what I'm arguing now is that Charles Williams is that same kind of writer, that the little gold coins are little round golden avatars that you click on, and the whole previous world of Arthurian texts and the whole previous world of dragon stories, including Beowulf, pops up. And all these little stories are pressed into little gold coins and scattered all over the face of the globe. The theological meanings that the Arthurian story was capable of bearing were darting everywhere so that people can gain access to Arthurian texts. But that's not where this ends, though. Williams was concerned about the unfettered interpretation ranging free, unconstrained by a reading community. When they laid the coins before the council, Kay, the king's steward, wise in economics, said, "Money is the medium of exchange." But the king's poet was not pleased. Taliesin's look darkened. His hand shook while he touched the dragons. He said, "We had a good thought. Sir, if you made verse, you would doubt symbols. I am afraid of the little loosed dragons. When the means are autonomous, they are deadly. When words escape from verse, they hurry to rape souls. When sensation slips from intellect, expect the tyrant. The brood of carriers levels the good they carry. We have taught our images to be free. Are we glad? Are we glad to have brought convenient heresy to Logres?" So the poet claims that if you made verse, you would doubt symbols. Remember that dragons are dangerous. Dragons are deadly. After all, even though Beowulf and Wiglaf killed their dragon, the dragon also killed Beowulf. Although Turin killed Glaurung, his despair soon led to Turin's death too. Although Bard killed Smaug, many people of Laketown died, both before and after, due to the dragon's depredations. And on Tuesday, we'll be looking at dragon sickness, which is another dragon-related danger. So, is it possible that symbolism could be as deadly as a dragon? William's spokesperson here, and his alter ego, Taliesin, seems to think so. So you see what the coins are then? The coins are textual symbols of textual symbols. But these textual symbols are only dangerous, according to Williams, when they are divorced from community. Community and relationship was extremely important to Williams. It could be argued it was the core doctrine of his life, was the ways that we interact and exchange and substitute for one another. And without this community, without what Williams called coherence, dragons are deadly. Without coherence, coins are deadly. Economics, stripped of the soul and of the relationship, is deadly. And without coherence, textual symbols are deadly. So it seems that Williams is arguing without a community of interpretation, intertextuality itself is deadly. So watch out for those intertextual dragons, because they can be hyper. So that was a lot of material for you on some aspects of Beowulf's intertextuality and some aspects of the Inklings' intertextuality. I'll see what questions you have here, and you can keep more of them coming up as we go. Let me do a little reorganizing here. See if I can. Okay. Sarah King, it's strange to me that Tolkien's dragons have never been human, but it's Lewis's dragon instead that has shifted shape from human to dragon. Yes, indeed, that is interesting. So by doing that, Lewis is referring back to the fact that Fafnir used to be human as well. Any intertextual references in How to Train Your Dragon? Sorry, Mickey, haven't seen it. Should I? Is it any good? Sarah King, is there any is there any aspect of writing that we can know for certain to not be intertextual? The simple answer is no. According to J.R.R., the theorist I've been quoting from somewhat today, he's got another word, transtextuality, and he says that all texts are transtextual because they are all participating in the relationship of all texts with one another. So as a thought experiment, the only non-intertextual piece of writing would be one that's purely imaginative, purely original, or the first piece of writing. But if you really want to get theoretical with it and push it to its extreme, the very fact that you are using words is intertextual because the words have all been used previously in other literary contexts. So the only non-intertextual text would be the first one. Okay, Timothy Fisher. Do dragons, sleepless worms as images of Satan, of threats to salvation, etc., appear in the Western liturgical texts? Because they certainly do not in Orthodox liturgical texts. And can we assume that Lewis and Tolkien would have been familiar with the former? And make sure I understand your first question. You're asking whether dragons do appear in Western liturgical texts at all? Or are you asking why they do in Western and not in Orthodox? Not 100% sure your question. They do appear in Western liturgical texts, and the Bible refers to the devil as a dragon as well, especially in the book of Revelation. So there is scriptural precedent for that. And can we assume that Lewis and Tolkien would have been familiar with the Western liturgical texts? Yes, I believe I can say yes, and of course they would be familiar with the scriptural precedent. Mickey says, Tolkien pulls off self-referential hypertextuality as a fiction. Could the Beowulf poet have done this as well and not necessarily assumed his audience knew the stories? Because Tolkien and those rearranging the furniture in Tolkien's attic, besides Tolkien, did any other author pull this off as a fiction as Tolkien did? Okay, a good series of questions there. Could the Beowulf poet have been making up these stories and not assumed his audience knew them? That seems unlikely to me. That seems unlikely to me because we have so many of the analog texts. So we have the Sigemund episode in Beowulf, but we have many other texts telling us the story of Sigurd, Sigmund, Siegfried. So these stories were clearly in wide circulation. So that seems unlikely. Of course, it is possible that the Beowulf poet may have made up some of these that we are reading as hypertexts, but I would say not the ones that have clear analogs. And then your next question, besides Tolkien, did any other author pull this off as a fiction as Tolkien did? Yes. Other authors who created imaginary hypotexts. Dune comes to mind. Dune, each section of Dune, they're not really chapters, but or they're not numbered, each section of Dune begins with an epigraph that is a quote from another book. And there are a good dozen or so. Some of you who took the Dune class can remind me how many. We can identify all these books that were written by the Princess Irulan, but they don't exist, right? Herbert made them up in order to quote epigraphs from them. So that's one that comes to mind. I think Canticle for Leibowitz does this, that it refers to many of the texts that the scribes are copying time after time, and I think we get snippets from them. So yeah, there are many other fictional writers who create an imaginary body of past texts and then refer to it. And maybe some of you can type some other instances in the questions as well. Richel asks, again, for the title of the book that goes in depth with intertextuality. If it's the one I quoted from a lot, J.R.R., the title is Palimpsests, Literature in the Second Degree. Maybe I can bring up the slide again that had that on it for you. I know I had the title on one of them just so you can copy it down. There it is. So Palimpsest's Literature in the Second Degree, 1982. This is a structuralist approach. Genet is arguing there that we can understand texts better by fitting them into an intertextual structure by seeing which other books they relate to. So it's a way of bringing certainty to our reading of texts. A post-structuralist theorist would have a different type of approach to that. Thank you for approving of my TARDIS mug. When you put hot water into it, the TARDIS leaves Earth and flies out into space. So that's very good. Sarah King, what happens when the reader's hyperlink is different from the author's, or when the reader sees a hyperlink the author didn't intend to insert? All kinds of fun stuff. This is when it's play, when it's the free play of meaning. So I could imagine an allusion where you intended none, but as soon as I read it into what you've said or written, then it's there, right? There's reader's agency involved. So one overly simplistic way to break down approaches to intertextuality would be to say that one approach is it's all author intentionality. The other approach would be to say it's all readerly agency. Okay, so theorists are divided on what they say about those. So that's what happens. If the author has put in a hyperlink and I do not recognize it as one, I just blow by it because I don't know the reference, well, then I miss it. That's what happens. And so the text is that much less rich to me as a reader than it would be if I knew the reference, right? So that's what happens to me as a child when I first heard The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I felt ashamed, perhaps, that I didn't know the right books. So that put me in the camp, with fat, stupid Eustace, who didn't know what was going on because I hadn't read the right books. So that was a case in which I had missed an intertextual reference and knew I had. Most of the time, if we miss a reference, we probably don't know it. We've just missed it. Okay, so Timothy, you're clarifying your question. Since dragons do appear in both Western and Orthodox liturgical traditions, should we include the Western Latin liturgical texts in discussing them as hypotexts, right? Yes, I do believe so. Okay, yes, two people both said J.K. Rowling, referring to many non-existent books. Yes, exactly. Some of which she went on to write after the Harry Potter series, such as Dangerous Beasts and Where to Find Magical Beasts. I'm messing up the title. Beasts and Where to Find Them, and the History of Quidditch, and so forth. Okay, so she's an example of an author who fakes her own hypotexts. Of course, she also refers to many real hypotexts as well. Her books are quite learned in referring to the literary traditions she would have encountered in school. Okay, Arnie Fishman, I don't know the text you're referring to, so if you wouldn't mind writing out a little bit more about that, then I can refer to it. Tom Hillman gives another example that I don't know. Carlos Ruiz Zafon in his Cemetery of Lost Books series. Okay, so he makes up imaginary hypotexts. Good. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I have a little more time, so I think what I will talk about for just a few more minutes is some more of Charles Williams' intertextuality that I left out. Sorry for the dizzying zoom through the PowerPoint again. Just put up the pretty last screen for you to see. So I'll talk for a few minutes a bit more about Charles Williams' intertextual approach, unless you pop up other questions about Tolkien, Lewis, or Beowulf, or unless you suggest other texts. So, as I said before, Charles Williams' Arthurian poetry was probably his masterpiece, and it works around a particular visual image. Okay, let me see if I can find the image while I'm talking. I didn't intend to do this, but I think I can find it pretty quickly. So his poems are set in an imaginary version of the Byzantine Empire, which you should now be able to see, yes? Let me make it bigger. Okay, so here's a picture of the Byzantine Empire with also a picture of a woman drawn over it. And this appeared in Taliesin through Logres in 1938. And it's just, this is 2 intertextual layers, but there are more layers than that throughout the poem. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of layers that are throughout the poem and then mention how they're used. Charles Williams was for at least 10 years a member of an occult secret society, the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross. So he would have studied many texts and ancient traditions there. So he would have studied the zodiac. And in occult tradition, the zodiac is matched up with parts of the body. So throughout his poetry, when Williams wants to refer to a certain part of the body, he might refer to it by the associated zodiac sign. But each of the zodiac signs is also connected with a certain character trait or virtue or personality trait. So if Williams wanted to refer to the personality trait, he might refer to the sign of the zodiac in question or the part of the body in question. All right? Let's add another layer. There is a tradition in the Kabbalah, in the Jewish mystical tradition, of the Sephirotic tree. It's a diagram in which each of the virtues that you want to achieve are associated in a sort of a flowchart kind of a way. And there is a drawing of the Sephirotic tree superimposed on a human body, so that each body part is associated with one of those virtues. So again, if he wanted to refer to a particular spiritual quality or virtue in the poem, now he can choose. He can refer to it by the sign of the Sephirotic tree, the sign of the zodiac, or the body part. Furthermore, now you can look at the image on your screen again and see that because the body is associated with countries in Europe, if he wants to refer to a spiritual virtue, he can refer to it by the sign of the zodiac, the mark on the Sephirotic tree, or the body part, or the associated country or region in Europe. So he's got 5 levels, and at least, I think there are others as well, and they're specifically intertextual, because each of them is a textual tradition, has written traditions associated with it. So this is a very richly intertextual map that Williams is using here and that he refers to throughout his poetry. So I just thought I would clarify that. And then I see that somebody has asked another question. Sarah King has asked for a bit more explanation about Charles Williams and the importance of community. Yeah, certainly. I'm happy to talk about that for a few more minutes as well. And I'll just mention, oh, thank you, Arnie. H.P. Lovecraft quoted a fictional book called the Necronomicon in several of his works. This idea has been so popular that multiple authors use that text as well, and we even have customers in bookstores requesting the book. Thank you very much for explaining that. Okay, so I'll finish up with talking more about Charles Williams and the importance of community, since it's such an interesting idea. I apologize that we've gone very far afield from Beowulf. We're now much more into the vice versa part of this course title, just talking about the Inklings. But I think it's fine to finish up talking today about the Inklings and their community life, because then on Tuesday we'll come back to the Beowulf text and dragons, and it will all be very nicely tied together. So Charles Williams and community. I'll talk a bit more about the doctrine of coherence. It's based upon a few spiritual principles, Christian principles. One is the idea of the perichoresis, the dance of the Trinity, that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are mutually interrelated in a dance of equality and mutual love and exchange and mutual self-sacrifice on behalf of the others. So the idea there is that community is built into the very nature of the universe, the very nature of God himself, so that all human relationships will be modeled after the relationship that exists in the Trinity. So that's one idea. The other doctrine is the idea of the hypostatic union, that Jesus was both fully God and fully man at once. So you see how both of these concepts, the Trinity and the hypostatic union, are mysteries. They're physically impossible. They defy the laws of physics, and they're impossible for humans to understand in a strictly geometrical way or on a strictly physical model. So Charles Williams, based on these doctrines and on the writings of the Church Fathers, developed his idea of coinherence, which is simply that we are all part of one another, that we are all correlated in very deep ways, that we are interrelated. And we see this in some particular sort of high moments of human relationship. So the most obvious is pregnancy, that the woman and the baby are clearly physically interrelated. One is inside the other, and they are physically connected, and that they are mutually interdependent. Of course, here it's much more of a hierarchy. They're not equally interdependent. Obviously, the baby is much more dependent upon the mother for nourishment and so forth. So that's one physical image of spiritual coinherence. The other physical image of spiritual coinherence, of course, is marriage, is the idea that the husband and the wife become one flesh, and that the best marriage then would be one that's modeled on the relationship of the Trinity, and also on the model of Christ's sacrifice for people, on behalf of people. So that's the theological foundation on which Charles Williams built this idea. So here's where the danger comes in that Sarah also asked about. Williams wrote that this is a fundamental reality. The idea that we are mutually dependent is a fundamental reality, but you can choose to deny it and fight against it, or you can choose to submit to it. So each human, he says, has a choice at any given moment. Am I going to live for myself or for the other? And so he would define salvation as living coinherently for the other, and damnation as living selfishly for oneself and against the coinherent bond. So that's where the danger comes in. And he dramatizes this in his Arthurian poetry because he has a group, a set of companions who are mutually interrelated. And when the round table falls apart and when the empire falls apart, so does this fellowship. And all the most terrible things happen because of the breaking of community and the great breaking of fellowship. As a matter of fact, in his poem, he says that the achievement of the Grail was supposed to happen during King Arthur's reign, and that would bring about the second coming of Christ. But because King Arthur and Lancelot and Mordred and the others denied the coinherence and denied the community, the second coming of Christ was postponed. So salvation was postponed and put off. So pretty much the worst thing that could happen to the human race. So that's the idea of community, and he dramatizes this in several other really powerful ways throughout his fiction as well. I'll mention the most memorable of them are in his next to last novel, Descent into Hell. There are three big exchanges that go on, because on this spiritual foundation, Williams also built the idea that you could exchange burdens for one another, spiritual or emotional burdens, just the way we exchange a physical heavy box or a bag or something. So he thought that if you were suffering under a fear or a grief, I could take it for you. I could carry it, and you would no longer feel that burden of grief or pain, because I would be passing it along to Jesus to carry on both of our behalfs. Okay, so to come back to the novel Descent into Hell, there are three moments of exchange in that. The first one is that the young heroine Pauline lives under a burden of terror because she has a doppelganger. Whenever she goes out of the house, she sees the doppelganger walking down the road, and she knows that someday she will meet it, and she will die with the terror of meeting the doppelganger. And another character says, "Give me your fear." And they exchange. He carries her fear for her, and she's no longer able to be afraid, with an amazing, powerful result. The result in the narrative is very powerful, so I recommend it to you. The second exchange of three in this novel is Pauline's grandmother is on the point of death and is sort of having visions, and she sees in her visions a man who committed suicide a while back in the town, and she's able to do a substitution for him that results in his salvation, even though he's already dead. And then the third substitution in the novel is the most dramatic. Pauline had an ancestor 400 years ago who was burned at the stake under Bloody Mary, and the night before he's burned at the stake, yes, I know it happened 400 years ago, just hang on to that. The night before he's burned at the stake, he cannot face the terror of the fire. He cannot face it. So he cries out in fear, and Pauline, 400 years later, is able to take his fear and carry it for him so that he goes to his martyrdom singing and shouting for joy and without that burden of fear. So those are three very powerful exchanges that occur in Charles Williams. So that's the way he believed we ought to live, and it's something he practiced in his own life. He practiced exchange with others. He would carry their burdens for them in his real life, and later in life he set up an order of his own, the Companions of the Coherence, in order to practice this and to carry one another's burdens. So in his poetry, he's enacting this by means of symbols. So he sees that the little dragon coins going out all over the kingdom are outside of community, that economics has been reduced to a sort of a bare, spare kind of cold exchange rather than the real communal exchange. So there's an introduction to Williams' idea of coherence, which is more than I thought we would get to today, but that's very good. Do we have any other questions? Any other questions about Tolkien or about Beowulf or any other material that I discussed today? All right. If not, we're just about at the end of our time. So I thank you very much. And I'll say goodbye for now. Cheerio.